So the first place I went was to a community in Missouri. And it was a small town, a few hours drive out of Kansas City. And I was taken around in a van by a guy who worked for the Sierra Club, but whose family had grown up, he had grown up in a farming family. And then several other people in the van, all of whom were farmers, and all of whom were raising livestock themselves. So very clearly, they were not people who opposed livestock production. But what they were telling me was, there's a new way of raising animals, and it has nothing to do with traditional farming. And they drove me up and down the streets of Unionville, this one particular community that was especially affected by concentrated hog production. And they showed me how within a 2 square mile radius, there were now buildings housing over 70,000 hogs. This was an area that traditionally raised just a few pigs, because really it's rolling hills and it's really ideal cattle country, not so much for hogs. But this is what it had become. And what had happened was the local citizenry, all of whom were farmers, most of whom were livestock farmers, had gotten very well organized, and they had had meetings, and they had actually passed a local ordinance saying, if you're going to farm here, you cannot do this and that and this, that you can't produce an odor that's a nuisance to your neighbors. You cannot pollute the streams. I mean, these are actually things that none of these things are allowed under the law anyways, but they wanted this to be codified in their local ordinances, because they were hearing about these big concentrated animal operations that were coming in other parts of the Midwest, and actually not too far from their area. So it turned out that Premium Standard Farms actually wanted, at that time, the second largest hog producing company in America, wanted to house a bunch of operations in their area. And so when they learned of the local ordinance that Unionville had passed, they simply went to the state legislature and got an exemption from that local ordinance. And then they began building their operations there. So by the time that I visited there, they had been fighting these operations for almost a decade, and there were 70,000 hogs there. So they had found that they were doing everything that they knew how to do as activists and good citizens and lawful, law-abiding citizens, and they just couldn't stop the political power of these operations. And they began instead to document the environmental pollution. So they started taking regular water samples, they started taking photographs, and what they found was absolutely very clear, unequivocal evidence that as soon as these operations started to function, every nearby stream, the levels of contaminants literally just started climbing like this, whether it was nitrogen, phosphorus, sediments, pathogens, whatever you want to test for. They were showing this, and they began documenting this, and they began turning this into the state, the regulators, and they began talking to their local politicians, and they found the same kind of response, which was basically no one was going to do anything to help them. So eventually they turned to lawyers, and it was the lawyers that began helping them to enforce the nuisance laws and the Clean Water Act, which essentially say you can't do any of those things.